epic. Just going to say this webinar will be recorded and you will get a link to it afterwards should you have to leave early or want to review what we've learned today. We also ask that you please share it in your networks. We think we'll cover some great stuff and hope to get as many eyes on this as possible. We ask that you use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask any questions that you might have of our panel. They have been notified to keep an eye out for it and will potentially answer in that function, or our moderators might uplift questions that could be widely applicable and we'll discuss it. For technical assistance, please go to Lena. You can private message her. She is working on the back end today. Many thanks to Lena. She helped put this together and couldn't be more grateful for that support. Before we dive in, just want to give a little bit of an overview on who EPIC is and who the Restoration Economy Center is within EPIC. So EPIC stands for the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. We are a startup within the Sand County Foundation. We work to essentially build policies that deliver speed and scale of ecological environmental progress. So that is often acting as a connector of folks that might not necessarily be connected, experimenting and thinking critically about what we can do better, and really focusing on speed, rapid response analysis. Within that, the Restoration Economy Center takes that big, broad idea and focuses it on to ecological restoration efforts. So these are our principles. I'm not going to read them all that we focus on, but essentially it's that speed and scale to ecological restoration and thinking about how restoration is a core piece of achieving our climate goals. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel today, just give a brief overview of everyone here. First, we have Dr. Jennifer Norris, who's the Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat at the California Natural Resources Agency. Thank you, Jen, for joining us today. We have Dr. Tim Mayo, the Executive Director of EPIC. Sara Johnson, who will be my co-moderator as well as a panelist. She's the Executive Director of ERBA. We have Kellyx Nelson, the Executive Director of the San Mateo Resource Conservation District, and Tim DeGraff, who's the Vice President and Region General Manager West at RES. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jennifer Norris to give us a quick high-level overview and welcome as we begin this discussion. Jen?
Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm glad to be here and talk to you about California's Cutting Green Tape initiative. I'm going to share my screen if I can figure it out. Is it always a question? Can you see my slideshow? I think it's still not in the right place.
I think just the present button, I think, would do it.
Yeah, it's showing up on the wrong screen now. Darn it.
It's okay. Don't worry about it. It's all good.
All right, I'm gonna do it the lame way. Sorry. Oh well, we're being recorded. So back to this. So California's Cutting Green Tape initiative is what I'm going to talk to you about today, and it's a key part of Governor Newsom's Nature-Based Solutions Executive Order, which he signed in October 2020. So this executive order had a suite of commitments for the state of California as a way to bring nature-based solutions to the fight against climate change, but also elevating biodiversity conservation as a key administration priority. One of the big initiatives that came out of that was our commitment to 30 by 30. So I'm going to give that a shout out because cutting green tape actually is a key element of that overall initiative. So our 30 by 30 California initiative is our commitment to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. And hopefully some of you have heard about this. It's actually an international movement, and California is one of many subnationals that has made this commitment along with over 90 countries around the globe. So really forward thinking, saying let's set aside 30% of nature to protect ourselves, protect biodiversity, and also address climate change. And then fundamentally give people more access to nature, bring nature closer to people and really build those connections. So California is at the forefront of this effort and we're really excited. We actually just released our final strategy on Friday of last week. And as part of 30 by 30, we did an assessment and we estimated that about 24% of our lands and 16% of our coastal waters are currently conserved in California, which means we have about 6 million acres to go on land and 500,000 acres in the coastal waters. So how are we going to get there? We have a bunch of proposed pathways that are outlined in our document. And this includes, really working on regionally led conservation, more land acquisition, increasing easements, enhancing conservation on existing protected lands, working on advanced mitigation. And then that one in green, which is to expand and accelerate environmental restoration and stewardship. And that is where cutting green tape comes in. We recognize that to protect biodiversity, we can't just protect what's left. There's going to have to be a lot of restoration of places that are either severely degraded or almost lost. So what is cutting green tape? Kellyx is going to tell you the origin story of this. It actually predates 30 by 30, but we do see it as a key part of the initiative. And it's California's initiative to accelerate the pace and scale of habitat restoration by improving regulations, processes, and policies. Who's cutting green tape? All of us. California's departments, boards, and conservancies, there are 27 of them. They're all on board and now really required to think about cutting green tape as part of their everyday business. We actually work closely with the State Water Resources Control Board. California Department of Food and Ag is thinking about it. Our State Historic Preservation Office is thinking about it. So it's really taking hold across all of government. And then we're working together with our restoration partners like Kellyx, really looking for how we can work together to make environmental restoration happen more quickly, efficiently, and cost effectively. So some of the things we're doing at the Resources Agency, sort of 4 big buckets of the work we're doing. One is to really improve our permitting and regulatory processes. Are we using all of the creative ways that we have within the 4 corners of the law to move restoration quickly? As Secretary Crowfoot, the head of the Natural Resources Agency, likes to say, winning slowly is actually losing. So how can we make sure that restoration happens? It's not enough to talk about it. It's not enough to fund it. We actually have to make it happen. And so are we using all the creativity that we have within the rules in front of us to push those good projects forward? We're also working to clarify and improve the use of our California Environmental Quality Act, which is the state equivalent of the National Environmental Policy Act. How can we put forward new creative ways of using the law? And also we just pushed forward a new exemption actually for restoration projects. It has a sunset, but it's a 5-year or 4-year window where we can really take environmental restoration projects and push them through the CEQA process more efficiently. And we've already approved at least 2 projects through that system and many more in the queue. So that's very exciting. We're also working to simplify our grant and loan programs to make sure that when we give out money, it doesn't take 5 years to get it in people's hands so they can do the good work that they need to do. And then finally, really working to enhance communication, coordination, and collaboration, which is where multiple agencies come together around a project and do the work in advance to make sure that, regulated entities don't get in that horrendous do loop where you talk to me and we work out a deal and then you go to the next agency and then you talk about it some more and then you come back to me 2 years later and the project's completely changed. What Grace didn't tell you is that I'm a recovering federal regulator. I spent 16 years working at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I actually, jokingly, I say that because it was a great honor. I looked for lots of opportunities and ways to make regulations happen more efficiently and for the laws to work effectively. And I found that coordination and collaboration across agencies, it's slow, but when you get it going, it can really make a big difference. So we put out a report just last month that synthesizes all the great work that we're doing. And I'll show you the website in a second. So really sort of synthesizing all the different ways that we're working to make progress on cutting green tape across the agency. Super proud of the work that all my partners have. And as I said, those are the websites where you can find more information. So the first one is our cutting green tape, and the second one is 30 by 30, which I can never miss a chance to promote. So with that, I'll stop sharing. Stop there.
Thank you so much. That was great. A couple of things, little quotes that you said really jumped out at me. One was that winning slowly is actually losing. And I couldn't agree more. I feel like that is kind of at the core of what we're all trying to accomplish here. So thank you so much. For those unfamiliar with cutting green tape, if this is the first time that you're hearing about it, we are really excited to have Kellyx Nelson, who was an integral part of the creation and around at the origins of this initiative, talk more about what it actually is. So Kellyx, if you wouldn't mind coming on. Great, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Kellyx Nelson, and I am the executive director of the Resource Conservation District in San Mateo County in California, but also I participate in the California Landscape Stewardship Network, where I chair the Regulatory Efficiencies Working Group, and that is how I engaged with this effort. I have no slides for you today. I was going to introduce myself. Hi, my name is Kellyx. I've been off PowerPoint for 4 days. So I just decided not to have any slides, and then I had this great opening line that Jen took. So, so yes, as Secretary Crowfoot says on climate change, winning slowly is actually losing. So we know that we have to keep up with the rate of change and disruption. We face major challenges and an existential crisis with climate change and biodiversity loss. We know that we need to do more restoration. We know we need to do it now. And we know it's not enough to fence off the spaces that remain intact and have some preserves. We know that we need to take really ambitious action to work more efficiently, more effectively, more quickly, and at the pace and scale that's commensurate with the pace and scale of the threats that are already marching forward. So part of this meant taking a look at the regulatory barriers to environmental restoration and stewardship, recognizing that the regulations intended to protect the environment cast a really broad net and sometimes have the unintended consequences of posing barriers to environmental restorations. And that they were designed to stop bad things from happening, but were not typically designed to advance environmentally beneficial actions. So at the California Landscape Stewardship Network, we believed that the paradigm needs to shift from seeing taking action as the biggest threat that needs to be slowed down, and considering that slow, piecemeal, or smaller restoration actions are also a significant threat. And that meeting this moment demands some new ways of thinking. So as the Deputy Secretary described, cutting green tape was born as an interagency effort anchored, as she mentioned, in the California Natural Resources Agency, supported by in partnership with other agencies, the California Environmental Protection Agency, Food and Agriculture, the State Water Resources Control Board. And so what happened was because the California Landscape Stewardship Network is this large collaborative of managing land stewardship entities that covers about 40% of the geography of California, the secretary was curious about this group. He calls us a coalition of the willing. And we were able to meet with him. And in that meeting, we said, look, the big barrier that we're facing is often environmental regulations. And he said, I always hear that, but what do you want me to do about it? And we said, well, actually, there's a few things we think that you could do right now. And that led to us partnering with the California Network, partnering with the Resources Agency to facilitate a series of roundtables in support of this initiative and other conversations with over 150 people in the state, representing everything from NGOs, environmental organizations, practitioners, regulatory agency staff members, businesses, the whole gamut, and preparing a report and set of recommendations that I'll put in the chat for you with a link to that report, entitled Cutting Green Tape, Regulatory Efficiencies for a Resilient Environment. There are 14 recommendations in that report that take place at really different scales, some making incremental recommendations for incremental improvements, some much more aspirational systems change, some clarifications of existing efficiencies. And I want to note that all of this work stands on the shoulders of giants, because we're not the first ones to come up with this idea. And at local, state, and federal levels, there's a number of efforts underway that were underway already. And so it's gotten to the point now where it's like a movement. It's a statewide movement that's owned by many, Deputy Secretary Norris said, who is cutting green tape? It's all of us. And there are, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has a new team that's separately funded for cutting green tape. It is an initiative of the Resources Agency. There are efforts moving forward with the Coastal Commission. There are nonprofit organizations that are working on this in some fashion, or it's a core function of these groups. There are interagency regulatory working groups. There's groups like ours. It's kind of grassroots, and that makes it hard to explain what it is, because there's a lot of people that are working on it in different ways. There are business groups, Ecological Restoration Business Association is also working on this in an advocacy way and providing technical assistance. So with that, I want to note that what some of these outcomes have been to date and what some of them are anticipated to be, and what the recommendations that we made do and don't include. So the idea is that we focus on shared purpose, environmental benefit, and not getting bogged down on the different perspectives and responsibilities that we all have. There is a solid understanding that environmental regulations and laws exist for a reason, and that there are legitimate concerns about reducing environmental protections. And that we want to improve efficiency and effectiveness to ensure that good environmental practices can happen, that agency staff can meaningfully participate in environmental restoration, and so that investments are like bond-funded grant programs in California or other things like that are effective and getting the most bang for the buck. The recommendations that we put in that report are a subset of all the work that's going on. It was always our hope that would be a catalyst, and it has been. But they do not represent the totality of what's moving forward with cutting green tape. And our report, because the opportunity really came through Secretary Crowfoot's invitation, it focuses largely on what can be done at the state level. There's not much focus on what can happen with federal permitting, but many of the recommendations at the state level work in conjunction with federal efficiencies, or are building on federal efficiencies, or leveraging them. Also, I should note that we focused on environmental regulations, not cultural protections. So our state historic preservation officer, that's to do with like historic resources and that sort of thing, it doesn't address those. But what is moving forward now is an executive order that Deputy Secretary referenced that includes cutting green tape explicitly in it, that says thou shalt do this, some clarifications about how we can use existing efficiencies that have already been issued, some new efficiencies being formed, and a culture shift that's really significant. One of the things that we discovered is when we looked at a lot of legislation, we realized that culture eats legislation for breakfast. And that if we're not all rowing in the same direction, thinking about how to advance projects, it's very easy for legislation, even with the best of intentions, to not function as intended. So a lot of our focus has been about how to make sure that we are honoring the protections in place and still finding efficiencies together. So many efforts moving forward. Happy to answer any questions about those afterwards. And there may continue to be iterations as we learn. Stay tuned for a case study or a professor from California State University is working on that we'll be sharing soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kellyx. That was really helpful. And it actually transitions well into my first question. So we could bring all the panelists up. This first question might be geared a little bit more towards Jen and Kellyx, but I think everyone who is around and observing could definitely benefit and chime in on this. The process that you just described, Kellyx, seems relatively daunting. It was large scale coordination. There's a lot of working groups, a lot of folks coming together. If I am in a different state, maybe in a position to try and achieve some of that coordination, do you have any thoughts on either the literally how it came to be, and who would be the right folks to reach out to initially?
Jen, did you want to answer that, or would you like me to?
I think you can, but I would just say that I think we really benefited from the California Landscape Stewardship Network taking the helm and sort of bringing people together to really pull those disparate threads together and really elevate the purpose, and then their ongoing ability to kind of keep the conversation going and the momentum going. So you definitely don't want to think about it like at the end. You want to think about the beginning, and Kellyx can talk more about that process, but I think we really benefited by having that third party sort of neutral convener to get the conversations started. So
yeah, in terms of like how to get this done in different states, I think different states probably have different cultures and different opportunities and different barriers and that sort of thing. I can say a little bit about what worked for us. I think part of what worked is that the California Landscape Stewardship Network is a network of practitioners. And so we are deeply rooted in what is actually needed on the ground to get these projects done. And we have a lot of credibility of advancing restoration. You know, like we're not developers who are wanting to build condos on wetlands and put some native plants around the parking lot and call it restoration. You know, these are people who are coming in really trying to get large scale restoration done. I think that's part of it. I think another thing is that we always, we came to the state asking, how can we support you where we have shared values? And we weren't really, we don't see ourselves as a lobbying entity or even an advocacy group that way. We really saw ourselves as a partner in offering support and how to get this done. I think that was probably, that probably made a difference. And also, we really, we honor the essential role of the folks who spend every day having to implement these regulations. You know, it's their job, the buck stops with them. So I think that's a little bit about how it worked for us, but I don't think there's necessarily a cookie cutter way to do it. I think that this case study that's coming out might be illuminating for what are some elements of this that might be replicable.
I just want to jump in and add to some of that question. It sounds like it was a mix of both. You had a parallel grassroots effort underway and this interest that was bubbling up from the bottom with organizations seeing the need to cut green tape. And then at the same time or shortly after, you also had that leadership support from the governor's office, from agency leadership. I don't know if you can speak to a little bit kind of what comes first there, or do you feel like to really see concrete permit changes, you need the regulators to feel like, my leadership has my back and they support me in being innovative and trying something new? As I know that's something that just from the National Association perspective, and also speaking with practitioners in California, right now we see kind of ad hoc some of these really efficient permitting mechanisms being undertaken, but California is the first place where we're seeing regulators feel bold enough and empowered enough to go out and programmatically develop these new permitting tools. So maybe speaking some to the grassroots versus that agency leadership authority.
Yeah, that's definitely true. With the many conversations that we had with folks, we realized that you need leadership at the top that's willing to lean into this, because without that, the disparate agency staff aren't able to implement this. You also need to honor what is the boots on the ground of agency staff who are living and breathing these regulations and see what works for them. We did hear from agency staff often in our conversations with them that they needed cover, they needed permission, they needed to be supported in this. We also saw that often before and often still, there are people who are hesitant to implement efficiencies that do exist in statute.
Right.
And it needs to be sort of normalized and supported in the culture of the agencies. And we had a particular opportunity with Secretary Crowfoot. In the early 2000s, there was another resources secretary, Secretary Nichols, that I think really was another big catalyst in California for getting this kind of work done. And so, but it was a while, and we were coming back, and Secretary Crowfoot was a big champion for what we are talking about. That made a big difference. Jen, do you have more thoughts about that as your role in agency?
Yeah, I mean, my position in part was created to help implement cutting green tape. And so I think that does make a difference. I came from a department, I came from something that was, sort of underneath and doing the day-to-day. And I think big initiatives can only go so far, but if you have sort of sustained support for it and people are working to actually, I mean, we had to find funding too, finding funding to actually do these things, you can't, I think that's a key element that should not be forgotten. And I think it's forgotten a lot, that there's sort of this like, do things better, coordinate more, go, and it's actually, it takes resources to make those kinds of things happen, because anytime you change the way you do business, even if you're moving to something that's incredibly efficient, getting there is not efficient, right? So that process takes resources. And if you're asking for dedicated teams to focus on restoration projects, that takes resources. Or even if you're just giving people space from the day-to-day crazy of all the permits that are coming at them, like Lucy in the chocolate factory. Am I too old for that reference, or did I just date myself?
Got it.
I mean, that's how it feels when you're in that seat. That's how it feels. It's just constant. And so to have any space to even think creative thought, how could this actually work better? That takes having enough people just to do the work. So all those things are key. And I think having someone at agency at my level who's looking across, I'm looking across state parks and DFW and our bonds and grants programs, and I'm hearing ways we can build connections, or we can sort of leverage budget asks together, or identify what those, real key, the things that are going to give us the most bang for the buck. I think that helps having a person in this role, keeping the momentum going and giving people that cover that this is actually a priority. And then, you get kudos if you do creative things. You're not actually punished, right. You're actually, lifted up. And so that creates more incentive for more people to want to do it. So I think it is important to have.
Absolutely. That's great to hear. Very insightful on what's happening in California. We wanted to keep building on this idea of focusing on some of the positive highlights. We would like to hear from all of those panelists that are with us that have seen this effort in California. What do you feel like is working really well so far? What do you look back and point to as accomplishments to date, and some of the tangible benefits that you're seeing for regulators, for the environment, for actual entities implementing these projects? And then also, as a part of that, maybe how is the state monitoring success and outcomes of cutting the green tape? Are we tracking the speed of restoration done, and able to look back at a year and say, we from a baseline, we are moving faster. So kind of both of those angles would be interested to hear from folks.
You said you wanted to open it up to other people. I don't know if Tim or
I did. Yeah.
Tim or Tim want to jump in.
Sure. Yeah, I'll hop in. Hey, everyone. Tim DeGraff. I'm a vice president of Resource Environmental Solutions. And in a nutshell, we are a private entity, largest ecological restoration company, and we implement projects. We build them, we design them, we sustain them throughout the country. Large scale restoration projects in all forms, from grant funded, bond funded restoration projects, water quality projects, advanced mitigation. So in our experience, and I manage most of our California operations, and what we've seen so far is, in terms of cutting the green tape, there's a lot of promise. There's two kind of elements or projects that I've been focused on and trying to apply cutting green tape towards, and that's advanced mitigation, as well as one of the largest restoration projects in the world, and that's the Klamath Dam removals. So, the Klamath Dam removals is a massive project largest river restoration project. It's specifically named as being suitable for the exemption. And there's promise. There's, the regulation came out in the middle of the process, and the lead agency on that project is the State Water Resources Control Board. And at the same time, the NEPA documents being issued by FERC were coming out. So that process is ongoing, but it looks like it could potentially save some time and move this vital project forward faster. So that's what we're seeing. On another element in terms of advanced mitigation, these are standalone mitigation projects. You can think of them as, a mitigation bank, a conservation bank, or a mitigation project done in advance of a specific impact. And there has been a willingness to look at those for the exemption. I don't think any have been exempted so far. We did, one of the great things that we've seen is the responsiveness of the department in reviewing the exemption applications. And so far we've applied for one on an advanced mitigation project and we got denied. And this is something for practitioners to be aware of, is the reason for the denial was not because it was a mitigation project, but because CDFW was the lead agency. So they specifically said, at this time, we do not want to give an exemption where we are the lead agency. So we're moving forward with other advanced mitigation projects and other smaller restoration projects through this potential exemption process. But that's, in terms of the responsiveness from the CDFW and the promise of some of these projects getting exempted and moving forward faster is what I've seen.
Thanks, Tim. That's helpful. And just for folks to know, so Tim was referencing the CEQA exemption that Jen had on one of her PowerPoint slides as one of the tools that's come out of this and been helpful for all sponsors of restoration, looking at where they can use that and not use that. And I think, you made a good point, Tim, on just the change in responsiveness that you've seen. And that speaks to Jen and Kellyx's earlier points on agencies. They need resources. They now have dedicated funding for CGT efforts. And so you're seeing that more of a collaborative partnership, the communication that's needed between the permit sponsor and the agency to really explore whether or not these work. So yeah.
In terms of some other outcomes, the day that Cutting Green Tape report was released, with that, the secretary also released a memo that clarified some things. So for example, there was an existing exemption to the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, that was underutilized because people didn't, it wasn't always clear that it could be applied in certain situations, like when you use construction equipment, for example. And he issued a clarification on that. So just right away, that wasn't a new program, a new law, a new exemption. It was a clarification so that people could better utilize existing efficiency. Then there was what Deputy Secretary Norris referenced, which was this new statutory exemption to CEQA that was really significant. There are also, she also showed you there's a report on what all these different outcomes are that's happened within her agency. And then in addition, there's these sort of spin-off things going on. So for example, the California Coastal Commission has developed a new tool with resource conservation districts, including my own, to programmatically permit large-scale forest treatments, forest projects for fuel load reduction and forest health in the coastal zone, which has separate special protections. And there's additional work going on with programmatic biological opinions of federal agencies like National Marine Fisheries Service with the Coastal Act, so that you can better permit salmonid fisheries restoration projects in the coastal zone. All sorts of, there are so many different efforts going on.
It's great to hear about what a movement it truly is and how it's permeating different agencies and cultures and the whole perspective for all stakeholders coming to these projects.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And you both touched on the CEQA exemption, and we had a couple questions in the Q&A box that I just wanted to raise up that maybe you could point folks to a certain spot, or if you have like a 1 minute kind of explanation on what qualifies as restoration under this exemption. You know, Tim mentioned that some of their projects might not necessarily qualify. And is that something that's still sort of being worked out as it's cutting green tape is rolled out, or if you could speak to that?
So for the particular CEQA exemption that we put through in the budget trailer bill last summer, there are specific criteria that are spelled out. So I put in the Q&A, but maybe it only went to one person, the link to the whole program. They called it SERP, so statutory exemption for restoration projects. So that is a good place to go and see all the different pieces and how we articulated this, what counts as a restoration project. And so, you know, to Kellyx's point before that, you know, some of our current exemptions are a little vague on, you know, what's construction equipment? Can you use something beyond a shovel? So we kind of did away with that. You know, it's much more about the purpose of the project, and it can have some ancillary benefits, but that it be sort of fundamentally about restoration. But there's specific language around that. And ultimately it's the decision of the head of the Department of Fish and Wildlife to determine if those criteria have been met.
Thank you, Jen. So backing up a little bit, we just talked about some of the successes that Sara pitched to you all, and I want to think about now some of the challenges that we're facing, having been rolled out, you know, getting into the weeds. What are some of the pieces that you all are still working on? And I actually want to take it to Tim at Epic first, who has a perspective, I think, since you kind of follow this across the country, if you could kind of a high level observation as you've seen and as you've talked to folks, if you have anything that comes to mind.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. I think just complimenting first some of the things that you all clearly got right. It's political leadership that supports that. I'm sure that quote by Wade has been used 1,000 times, but it's clearly connected to something else, Kellyx, that I think you said, which was permission, right? So the agency staff feel like they need permission from people higher up to act, and so the leadership support can very much do that. Kellyx, you talked about a regulatory efficiencies working group, and I think Jen, you mentioned that there's now a budget for an internal team who focuses on this. Those are other key parts of it, right? You need outside stakeholders who have a common sense of mission, even though they're not advocates, Kellyx. They have a sort of a shared vision of what they think a better future looks like. And then you have internal people who, wake up in the morning and think, this is my job. I think some of the complexities that I, worry about, whether it's in California or in other states or at a national scale, is there's not just the state rules, right? But there's also local government, municipal government complications, and then the interaction with federal law and federal policy. So, that's one area where I'm really curious of your efforts to coordinate with the Endangered Species Act or with Clean Water Act, permits and adoption processes, noting that, some states in the last few years took on basically administration of the Clean Water Act of wetland permits. That's a pretty different approach to streamlining. But just the interplay between, multiple different statutes at different levels would be one thing that I'd flag as a challenge. And then I guess the other one is, and I guess I see this a little bit in the documents you all have already provided, is that as you come up with something new that's meant to simplify things, then guidance immediately starts accumulating that explains it and interprets it and gets longer and longer itself. So, are you sort of simultaneously trying to make sure that the efficiencies themselves remain, efficient?
Yeah, I would say all that is true. And I always go back to the beginning, which is none of these laws were written to work together, right? There's a law, and then someone's like, there's a gap, I'm going to write another law, but then there's overlap, and then there's a little more overlap, and then you add the feds and the state and the locals. And yeah, I mean, I came here from New Mexico, where I had administered the Endangered Species Act, and I came to California, and I remember sitting in sort of the first meeting I had with folks that needed permits, and there were probably 8 agencies around the table, I mean, the good news, we were all around the table, but I thought, wow, how do people get things done? And you know, a key part of it is really that the agencies talk to each other, and find those places where there is good overlap and where you can sort of bend the rules is wrong, but bend the process so that you can use the same information in a slightly different context, but still get to the same result. And I did that a lot as a federal partner. I see there's a lot of overlap with, you know, the Endangered Species Act and wetland work, particularly in the Central Valley. You know, there's a lot of things that the Corps of Engineers and the service are doing together where we're streamlining. But one thing that's happening at the state is that so DFW, we keep talking about that in the Department of Fish and Wildlife, you know, they now have a cutting green tape program, a unit that is, there's a great leader of it, there's staff. And one of the things they're pushing forward is they're bringing back the consistency determination. So if you have a federal Endangered Species Act permit, you can use that sort of as a stand-in for your state permit for, at least for restoration projects. But I would argue if you can start to, you know, build these processes in, they should be working for, you know, wherever it's appropriate. But in any case, they're bringing those back so that you don't have to do 2 standalone documents. And I think, you know, Tim was pointing to the Klamath project where SERP might sort of fill in that same kind of thing. You've gone through this whole federal process, because something like a dam removal, that's super complicated. You wouldn't want to completely bypass your environmental review, but to duplicate the EIR and the EIS, and they're almost the same, but they're not quite, and it's really a lot of work. It's nice to be able to sort of use those processes as duplicates. So that's another thing that's moving forward. And I'm sure there's more that I don't know about with the water board.
Timothy spoke to the efficiency of your efficiencies. And I wanted to sort of underscore that because, you know, often what we're working on here is unintended consequences of environmental policies. And sometimes with the best of intentions, people try to find efficiencies or streamline those, but there are so many hoops to jump through with that there's unintended consequences of the efforts to address unintended consequences. And it can kind of get infinitely regressive and not be actually streamlined. I think that this speaks to what Jen was just talking about bringing people together and really starting from a place of shared vision. Is our job to apply statute in the most like restrictive way possible, or is our job to have environmentally beneficial outcomes? And then how do we use statute to ensure environmentally beneficial outcomes rather than to just slow things down?
I think great, great feedback from everyone on thinking about this. I'll chime in more so from a panelist perspective for a moment. You know, something that I hear about from both folks operating in California and nationally is that sometimes the green tape isn't just necessarily the permit processes. It can also be just the lack of agency capacity to administer the program, to respond to requests, you know, even for existing programs such as, you know, conservation banking in California. If the agency is not staffed and equipped to timely process reviews and reply to a project sponsor, that's slowing down the rate of restoration done under that program and the investment incentives for practitioners to go out and do more projects. And so I think a big current challenge that we're still wrestling with and thinking about how can we support through the legislative process, through communication to the governor's office, the need for the state to really invest in just staffing at the agency level, training and resources, that can make a huge difference, almost as impactful as any of these new permitting tools that are being developed. So just thinking about that lack of staffing is also green tape that needs to be addressed and needs to be a priority, has really been a recurring theme as ERBA and ERBA discuss internally what can be done.
Yeah, I want to give that a hard underline. You know, the Department of Fish and Wildlife gets gets a lot of complaints. And I think at the core of it, I'm not saying this is all of it, but a big piece of it really is that underfunding. You know, they did a service-based budgeting analysis where they looked at, you know, all the different processes they've got across the whole agency, from law enforcement to fishing licenses, and the place that they are grossly underfunded is in this environmental permitting realm. There isn't a clear, you know, there isn't a good amount of money for that work. And as someone who did it, it's grinding work. It's really hard. I mean, even when you're talking about a good environmental restoration project, part of your job is to sort of look for problems and sometimes say no. And that's hard because you get into this because you care about conservation. You get into this because you care about the species. And then you're in this sort of semi-adversarial work all the time. And so then there's a lot of staff turnover, right? Because you're doing so much more than really one person should do. Then you lose people, then you lose momentum, you lose, you know, institutional knowledge, and that makes things take longer as well. So all of that is the culture of the regulatory environment. You know, I think about DMV, like back when it was, you know, the 10-hour wait to get your license. There was probably a lot of turnover there. They seem to have their act together again, and it makes a difference. So speech over, but I'm totally with you. I think it's such a key part of the whole puzzle.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for that, Jen.
We have a couple chat questions that I want to make sure we get to. The first was one that Sara raised, but I think we kind of got off on another focus area. How are we measuring effectiveness of these projects or effectiveness of the initiative? And is that something that is sort of in this, not quite a challenge, but like a work in progress as it's being rolled out?
Jen, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, so I sort of of two minds. Like, one, it's hard to measure that. It's just hard, right? Like, what should a permit take? Who's taking what? Is it because the permit requester came in and really had no information and you had to go back to square one? There's a lot of permutations of how things can take a long time. But I will say that within resources, actually the meeting I walked out of to come to this meeting, we are building actually a tool to monitor all the investments that we're making and make sure that they're actually resulting in what we intended. So we're building an online portal that will also be a place where people apply for their funding, and you can track the progress that they're making to get the project on the ground, which will allow you to look at how long they sat in the permitting space. So having those tools in place just to even monitor how well you're doing is another piece of the big puzzle, but it's just getting underway. So I don't know, I don't think we have good baseline data. Although I would say that the feds do. You know, they've been tracking for a very long time how long all their permits take. I just don't think the state has that kind of infrastructure built.
So
but we are hearing anecdotally that people are seeing progress. So sorry, Kellyx.
Oh, sorry. I looked at that question about 5 times and thought about how to answer it. And the reason I didn't is because with the California Landscape Stewardship Network, we talk about this a lot. And I think where we are currently is not how are we measuring, but how do we measure? Because I think it's actually not that obvious. If you're talking about how long it takes to complete permitting or regulatory compliance, it turns out that's kind of complicated because it kind of has to do with when you start the clock or when you stop the clock. So what about if, the project proponent actually kind of pumps the brakes for a little while? And also, if we don't have really adequate baseline, these aren't apples to apples. So how do you compare this project to a previous one? The other thing that I think about is sometimes this kind of like coordination or efficiencies can make a better project, but it's not necessarily faster. Or you can find efficiencies in how much it costs, or with monitoring requirements after the fact that were unfunded mandates, if this is a grant-funded project. So it's not entirely clear to me how to do this. I had asked a few folks if maybe our legislative analyst's office could take this on and do something that's more analytically based about what the actual benefits are, including cost to the state, or efficient delivery of conservation dollars to projects. or going to the right projects, or, you know, I think there's so many different possible ways to do this. And I think that it's appealing for me as a practitioner, just want these things to happen faster. But I think that that's actually more complicated than it looks. And what can happen, what I have seen happen, is when there are mandates that an agency process within a certain window, if they are, to Sarah's point, if they are limited in their resources, sometimes what I see is they'll bounce back applications and require new things so that they can start the clock at a different time, because they just didn't have the capacity to do it the right way. And then it actually creates more hoops for us to jump through to get to the point where we start the clock to demonstrate that it was done in a short period of time. So that was a very long answer to say, I don't know. But it's something that I'm thinking about a lot too.
Yeah, I really appreciated, super thoughtful response, Kellyx. Thank you. And we are actively brainstorming on it as well. We've thought, you know, maybe one of the stepping stones there is if there's initially some sort of database tracker that just, you know, for projects that are availing themselves of some of these CGT benefits, do we just publicly track kind of the status of their review and how they're moving through the process? We can maybe look to, you know, some examples at the federal level, like Fast 41 for tracking high priority infrastructure projects, have a similar dashboard available for high priority restoration projects in state. That's one thing we've been thinking about, and it would just be a step towards understanding how to track things if we have some level of transparency initially. I know we wanted to close on a question about how to take this to the federal level, so we'll get to that. First, wanted to highlight the second outstanding question here in Q&A, and I'll turn it over to Tim Mail to maybe tee this one up and provide some thoughts initially.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Just one comment on the tracking thing first. My plea to Jennifer and folks in California is that maybe one way to start is to just identify, really anecdotally, like 5 to 10 projects that went wicked fast in terms of permitting and authorizations, and another handful that you know are going slower than you want. And just start tracking what's happening with those. And I think, honestly, especially the fast ones are really important at this stage of your initiative. Why did this project go so fast? Did we accidentally skip a step? Is it just really simple, great people? But I think sharing those kind of anecdotes, and Kellyx, you described a case study, could be really helpful. And so that's a good place to start. And people will say, no, you have to come up with a comprehensive system that tracks everything at the same time. Sure, somebody else can do that in 4 years, but just looking at some of the anecdotes today, I think would really help inform other people who can say, well, I think I could copy that. I could copy what they did there. And you'll find, I think, you're empowering, you know, project leads and advocates to take some steps forward. The question in the chat box was around the EAJA, the Equal Access to Justice Act. And I guess the way that I'd answer that question in the context of permitting, and that really applies mostly at the federal level, is that, you know, government loses a lot of lawsuits, and a lot of those are around environmental issues. In many cases, they're losing lawsuits the same way every time, and the commenter sort of references this. That's a great recipe for finding places that we should be improving process and answering questions. I guess what I see that happens in permitting. And Sarah, you mentioned the Fast 41 or the Federal Infrastructure Permitting and Improvement Council, is there are key questions that don't have a scientific or a legal answer, right? How much impact is too much? How much mitigation is the right amount? It ultimately takes a judgment call. And sometimes there's a pretty fair and obvious basis for an agency to make a decision that a judge or a court is going to defer to, reasonable, you know, agency expertise. But in other cases, there's like 5 or 6 competing things that agencies need to decide. If you look at the documents, they don't often address all of those things or many of those things. And from one case to the next, they're addressed very differently. And those seem to me to be really obvious cases for both inside government and outside government groups to get together and say, you know, do we have an answer to this? Is there a way we could help agencies create a stepwise process to resolve this issue? Is it something that a director's memo, a secretarial order, or some other, sort of policy guidance from an appointed or a senior career leader could help resolve. So at minimum, you have consistency, right? Even if it's not still the right answer, at least it would be consistent. And so I think it's actually, to me, a promising ground that the litigation that the questioner refers to is a really promising space in which to look for places to create efficiencies. Agencies also practice really defensive permit writing and authorizations, partly driven by that litigation, partly driven by losing. And it's often not clear to me that they should be doing that. They're losing not because they don't write a long enough document. They're losing because they don't answer a key question. And the longer document still doesn't answer that question. And so that's a great space for senior attorneys within agencies, federal and state, to say, look, let's stop doing more writing and more analysis. Let's start actually getting to the heart of the question and being much clearer about that. And I certainly see, I'm less familiar with it at the California level, or at least in most other states, but certainly the solicitors' opinions at the federal level are a really useful space in which to resolve some of that uncertainty and create a legal basis for doing so. And I think a lot of that could be really useful, and the litigation can inform, better permitting and better authorizations.
That's great, Tim. Thanks. Yeah, really helpful in identifying some immediate ways to take action and better look at this problem and utilize current processes to find those improvements. We want to take the last few minutes of the session today to think about how do we take the positives, the lessons learned from CGT, and bring that up to the federal level. We've heard from multiple panelists, also just thinking about how to better integrate federal agency participation in CGT actions that are currently underway. We've seen these interagency groups of localities, state, federal agencies sitting on 8-person or more, interagency teams. And so how do we prompt federal buy-in and encourage taking the initiative to that level? Would love to hear thoughts from the panelists on where that process might start. And I'll initially kick it over. Would love to hear from Tim DeGraff with that practitioner perspective, where you see opportunities to try to streamline some of the federal permitting, federal environmental permitting.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and Kellyx had mentioned this before, but where we see some of the hangups in the permitting process for restoration projects is in typically one aspect of the federal process. There's, in California and other states, there's a complex state process, but focusing on the federal process, it's usually with the Endangered Species Act consultation. So with the Army Corps, there's a nationwide permit number 27 that we use widely. And that's kind of a streamlined version of the 404 process. It's a nationwide permit that's already generally approved if you meet the specific conditions. With the Endangered Species Act, most of the time there is no similar nationwide permit. The most similar thing that we've seen is the programmatic consultation. And Kellyx had mentioned there is, NIMS has developed one. I think they're developing others that are on a regional basis. Restoration projects in Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta, for example. The service used to have one for vernal pool ecosystems. And it was, very prescribed. If you do this, you get your Endangered Species Act consultation. And so that's one aspect from the permitting process, and that could apply to all restoration projects. In terms of an advanced mitigation project, what we've seen in California work well is standard templates for HMMPs for standalone mitigation projects, bank templates. We work in other states where there are not those templates for the documents, and everyone is a custom project. So, in terms of developing the rules of the road and certainty for the public entity, private entity, NGO, I think is important to move these projects forward. And I would also just kind of take a step back on going back to the metrics. I think in my bias is one of the most important things we have to look at, because we're losing so much so quickly, is not just the permitting timeframe, but getting the projects built. When you look at tracking those vital restoration projects, are they actually built? And I know, Jen and Kellyx mentioned that's not in the regulatory agency's control, but we need to track that. That is vital. So I'm off my soapbox.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, that's what we're all working towards, the actual on the ground outcomes and actually seeing those ecological services restored. So we need to know, how we're moving towards it. Curious thoughts from others on bringing this to the federal level, where to start. It could also be, does it start as just a pilot program? Is it something like exploring, as Tim described, kind of nationwide permits for ESA? Is legislation needed? Is it an executive order? Open to all those thoughts.
I don't have a simple answer for that, but I do think that one area to explore is building on existing federal efficiencies. So there's the federal consistency determination with the Coastal Act that can be applied for both coasts. There's programmatic biological opinions for listed species in limited geographic regions with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that generally aligns with the Corps' NWPs. There's the National Marine Fisheries Service has pretty significant biological opinions. They were really early adopters of this, and I think it would be great to see how it has saved them resources and advanced their recovery plans and help them meet mandates. That's a real need, I think, for those metrics, that evaluation. The Army Corps of Engineers, of course, as Tim just mentioned, has the nationwide permits, the NWPs 27 and 33. So for bank stabilization, aquatic habitat, and temporary construction, access, and dewatering. And then the Army Corps also has the regional general permits for fisheries restoration and some other things. So there's a few of those that exist now, and it seems like there's some opportunity perhaps to learn from those, learn how they, I think that getting programmatic solutions within these agencies is quite possibly easier than federal legislative changes, and they can build on what they've already done, and it'd be great to learn from them how they experience those efficiencies.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Kellyx. I think that's a great starting point and helpful. I appreciate you sharing the index of current efforts and opportunities too in the chat. That's helpful. Thoughts from any? Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, Sarah, I'll just jump in. I just pivoting off of what Kellyx said and the mentions before of the Federal Infrastructure Permitting Council. It would be great to create a FRIPC, basically an infrastructure council that has restoration in it. It could be done under the existing statutory authority, right? You just define a set of restoration projects as of national significance, projects like the Los Angeles River restoration Army Corps project and city and state supported project, where you put 10 projects on a national list. You create a really a single responsible agency, create clear timelines, a problem solving team, which is what that ultimately is. Would love to see something like that happen, and it could happen. I mean, legislation would be great too, but it really could happen under the existing, authorization. Klamath Dam removal, great example of a project that would be ripe for something like that, and removal and restoration, Tim, to your point. I also wanted to flag that especially Jennifer and Kellyx, for your awareness, your effort partly inspired some legislation that just passed last week in Maryland that created a green infrastructure, what is it called? The Green Infrastructure, Permitting Commission that'll endure for 3 years, looking for improvements in process around permitting of ecological restoration, green and blue infrastructure.
That's cool.
So hasn't happened yet, but at least it's been authorized as a deadline and a mandate and a membership set up. And then on the last comment is on Endangered Species Act, where I think there's a really, and the permitting, unless there's a federal nexus, which there often is, but where there sometimes isn't, it's really difficult to figure out how to approve restoration permits that cause incidental take of listed species. And often people, go through contortions to try to avoid every last possible incidental take, so that they don't, have to deal with that in a Section 10 permitting context. But I think if there is a Section 7 nexus, really looking at ways that net benefit ecologically restorative projects that are going to cause take, but leave species better off. What the Fish and Wildlife Service could do to basically in advance say that the definition of the project itself meets the reasonable and prudent measures criteria required, for the agency consultation. So again, if a project, and this is the simple way that I think about it, if a project is going to, leave a species better off, it's got, a prescribed burning project is a great example in a grassland habitat where some of the nests or the animals might be killed. Allowing a project like that to go forward with no reasonable and prudent measures, but for the project design itself, leaves the species better off. So, as the agency's time better spent coming up with, tiny little tweaks and adjustments or major ones to other kinds of projects, I think almost always that'll be the case. So I'll leave it at that. And again, that's a really fruitful and wide open space for creativity under the ESA.
So I would just offer, Tim, one of the things we did, you mentioned this, if you don't have a federal nexus, people want to avoid HCPs at all cost. I want to put in a plug that it's actually possible to make that happen. It's quickly. It's again the same kinds of problems that we've talked about before, but we actually put into place in my office 3 different programmatic opinions for PG&E for all of their operations and maintenance across all of their lands across the whole state. So they now have permits for the Bay Area, for the San Joaquin, and then for all the other sort of places around if they have to go in and do, pole maintenance, line repair, even their pig digging underneath. And so we actually managed to put together those permits in 2 years. And that was based in large part on some, coming together around a set of assumptions and a set of sort of agreements around how we'd sort of put those reasonable and prudent measures together up front and agree on sort of how we'd estimate habitat across the state. So I point to that as an example. And I'd also tell you that, the Fish and Wildlife Service has been working on, I've already forgot the name of the online portal that they're trying to develop with consistent, reasonable, and prudent measures for a suite of actions across the country, right, for different species. Sara, do you remember what it's called?
I think it's IPAC.
IPAC, thank you, I forgot.
It's the little A, yeah.
IPAC.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
great.
that's moving along. I think that came about, about 5 years ago, and I think it's starting to build. And so we're building these suites of actions. And so to your point about building into the project description, the measures, the more you can come and say, yes, this is our project and it'll leave everybody better off. Or also while we're there, we'll make sure that the salamanders don't fall into a ditch and drown. Like we can do all those things up front and build it. That will save a ton of time. So I think IPAC is actually, it's another one of those things that started out like, is this going to work? But I think it's starting to build momentum and be a useful tool across the state. And that actually started from, I think, customs and border protection projects. So it started as a pilot because they had all these projects that needed to go fast along the border, but then they were able to expand the model for the whole country. So again, like it's good to start with something that's concrete and you can wrap your brain around, and then you can actually build on something bigger.
Yeah. And just real quick, Sara, the other thing I wanted to mention about a possibility for streamlining at the federal level, and that, and I don't know, Dr. Norris, if that was, the PG&E programmatic, if that was any of that funded through WERDA, like the positions to get that?
PG&E funded them. So
PG&E
PG&E paid to put people in my office to help us get those done. So that's kind of the key. But you're right, like there are WERDA positions. I think they've been funded through other programs where they've helped move other things along.
Yeah, and I think nonprofits and private entities don't have that ability. So that might be something to do is, for restoration project, I can see it's kind of a Pandora's box. You don't want like developers just funding positions to build their condos, but, because we're losing so much and because of the, the staff turnover, just the lack of funding from the regulatory program and whatever agency that might be a way to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. It goes back to the staffing, just having that funding mechanism in place. Yeah. Could be expanding WERDA 214. So a lot of seems like immediate opportunities to explore on having a kind of an on-ramp or some sort of entry point to bring this movement to the federal level. Really appreciate that. With that, I'll turn it back to Grace to wrap us up. And thanks so much for letting me be a part of the conversation today.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. It's been great to co-moderate with you. And thank you to all of our panelists. I think we got at some really great takeaways for others, maybe trying to start thinking about doing similar work or what pieces they want to incorporate in the initiatives that they're already starting. And I think there's immense opportunity and no lack of great minds thinking about these important issues. So thank you all for your time. And thank you all for joining us for this panel. You will receive a link to a recording in the upcoming days, and we ask that you share it widely so that more work like cutting green tape and similar initiatives can proliferate and spur great restoration work. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.